Wow, what a question. What comes to mind right away is I would like us to be able to take the time and the resources to teach each student as they need to be taught or as they are best taught. And for so many students, that is not sitting still at a desk. It's just not. And for other students, it is. I think I probably, was a great sit at a desk type of student. My brother, the opposite, not someone who likes sitting still. I think also the ability to really recognize that tests are not the best way to measure knowledge. Again, for some people, they might be. And I think educational leaders give the idea of, testing isn't the only way to measure knowledge. It gets a lot of lip service. But in reality, it always comes back to that.
That's Laura Mead, a teacher and administrator with more than 2 decades of experience. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Laura Mead is a teacher and an administrator with 20 years of experience in special education and is currently the co-director of Pathways Academy, a school for students on the autism spectrum that's run by McLean Hospital, one of the world's most prominent psychiatric hospitals. Pathways works with students between the 3rd grade and 22 years old who are on the autism spectrum and who also often have co-occurring psychiatric diagnoses. Laura's background is in psychology, education, and art, and she's taught elementary and middle school special education students with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges in both private and public school settings. And she's also taught in general education classrooms. Laura grew up in the Capital District region of New York State, which rides along the Massachusetts border. When Laura was in college, she imagined herself becoming an artist, but made the decision to enter education instead. McLean Hospital, based in Belmont, Massachusetts, maintains the world's largest neuroscientific and psychiatric research program in a private hospital, and it's the largest psychiatric facility of the Harvard Medical School and an affiliate of Massachusetts General Hospital. McLean is consistently ranked first among psychiatric hospitals in the United States by its peers and in U.S. News and World Report. McLean is ranked number 20 among all independent hospitals worldwide in receiving National Institutes of Health grant support. McLean provides both inpatient and outpatient services to clients. It's also known as the hospital, which is the setting of Suzanne Kazan's 1993 memoir, Girl Interrupted, which was later made into a movie starring Winona Ryder and Angelina Jolie. Boston Globe columnist Alex Beam wrote the 2003 book Gracefully Insane about McLean and some of its most famous alumni. The Hospital of Tudor Mansions had its landscaping designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who is also one of the hospital's most famous patients. Other famous patients include the writers Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath, the musicians James Taylor and Ray Charles, and a host of other well-known and everyday people. As a part of its work, McLean runs several education facilities, including the Arlington School, a high school for students with mental health challenges, and Pathways Academy, the school where Laura is the co-director. Today, we're going to discuss education and teaching, students and learning, bringing creativity to the classroom, the motivations and challenges of teachers, and what a fair and just world would look like for students. So, Laura, I just wanted to thank you for coming on. I've always really just given my, mother's interest in education and how important as somebody, in my own shoes as somebody who is both sort of, I grew up with a reading, writing, comprehension problem. I've really cared deeply about education. I think it has, just this powerful opportunity to open doors for people, level playing fields. And I've wanted for some time to do have a conversation with someone from the profession, someone who has been a teacher. And after my mom, who was a teacher, passed away at the in October of last year, one of my actual listeners who knew about it reached out and said, "Jason, I think it's time for you to do this." So I'm really grateful for her bringing it up, because even thinking about the topic and thinking how important sort of education is and how important what she did was has probably been like healing for me before we've even gotten a chance to have this conversation.
Nice. That's so nice to hear. I'm so sorry about your mom. That's not a long time ago. That's pretty soon.
Yeah, yeah. I think for me, one of the sort of it has definitely been hard. It's been lonely, all sorts of things I never would have expected. But one of the things that I've found for me that there has been a lot of peace in my grief, in the sense that, we were lucky enough to have some time with my mom before she died. And it was very, I think, clear to me that she was proud of me and she thought I had done well. I think it was very clear to me what she wants for my life, which is happiness. And all of those things have probably drop some barriers for me, things that were sort of like getting in my way of moving forward. And then the other piece of it that I think has been really powerful has been I think it has allowed me going through the suffering has allowed me to love people much more deeply than I could before, and that has been super surprising for me.
Wow. Yeah. That would be surprising for me too.
Yeah, it's not what I expected. Not at all. um what I expected. It's and it's funny because I think in thinking about like even a topic like special education students, or someone who goes through a mental health crisis, or somebody who has, goes through a traumatic experience, or whatever it is, a loss like this. I think a lot of times we look at that from the outside and we say to ourselves, like, I can't imagine what that would be like. But I really do believe that concept, that idea of suffering and pushing through suffering and finding peace in suffering is one of the few things that's universal, that like unites the guy in Beijing with me right now, unite someone whose politics are completely different. We all experience suffering, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. So true.
Well, I wanted to just sort of start off, and I think this is a decent transition. You know, and my mom, growing up, she was a special education teacher and a special education administrator. It's an interesting career. She started off early in her career, before I was born, working as a principal of a special education school, actually, too, in Maryland. And then she went back into the classroom as I and my brother, who was 2 years younger than me, were growing up. And then eventually, once we were gone and out of the house, she went back to working as a coordinator and an administrator in special education. And so, even beyond that, you know, I always wonder every time I talk to a teacher about what motivated you to go into this work in this field. I imagine it was not for the money. Um, so I'm curious, what drove you toward it?
Such a great question. I think partly for me, the idea of just working with adults day in, day out seems really boring and not a lot of fun. So I think for me, partly it was fun and it just seemed like, if you have to go to work every day, why not do something that feels really enjoyable, that feels fun, and that you can be creative with? And I didn't start out, it's not like I grew up wanting to be a teacher. I remember in like elementary school, I wanted to be a scientist. And then when I got to middle school, I started thinking about being an artist. And in high school, that's all I wanted to do. And I went off to college and went to art school. And God bless my parents for all of both me, my brother, and my sister. They were just like, follow your heart, things will fall in place. So they have a couple artists. But when I got out of college, I realized that with a bachelor's degree in art, there really wasn't much I could do. And so it's like it got me to college and through college. And I also got a bachelor's in psychology while I was there, which was always, like a second love. And so, here I was with a bachelor's degree too, actually, and kind of like, yeah, it's still minimum wage jobs are still what's available to me. And I just had this idea I graduated in 96. I had this idea that once you go to college, when you're done, you get a good paying job. Like it didn't matter what you did, you'd come out and you could, have a family of four and live comfortably. And it wasn't like that. So I was trying to figure out what to do. And my mom, who was working in our high school's main office after I went to college. She had stayed home with us kids for years and years. And I think it was just after I went to college, she went back to work as a secretary in the main office. And so my brother was still in high school at the time and could stop by for money for lunch and everything. I didn't get that benefit, but she was telling me they're always looking for people in to sub for teachers' aides and teacher assistants. And at the time, without a teaching degree, I didn't qualify, at least where we lived in New York State, to be a substitute teacher, but I could be an aide. And so I applied and got my name on the list, and they did. They'd call every day. And I really enjoyed it. So it's not like I grew up wanting to be a teacher, but I think I've always had that kind of the heart of enjoying working with kids and loving learning myself. And it just naturally kind of fit together. And so just different times I'd be sitting, on a job somewhere working with kids being like, I could do this. Like, this is something I could do every day and it would never get old, you know?
Oh, yeah. Like one of the things as you were talking, one of the things that really struck me was the part where you said you wanted to do something creative. And then afterwards, you mentioned studying art. And I've always thought of one of the things about teaching, as much as there's science and there's research behind it and methodologies and approaches, like once you get into the classroom, like the only analogies that I've really been able to think of that accurately describe it, it's like either being in a firefight, like where you better have a good plan, but Lord knows what's going to happen, or like it's a canvas where you have to paint in the moment for multiple audiences, right? Because your kids are all at different places and you have to get through them. And you as a teacher, and I think there's a huge underappreciation for the creativity that is required to be able to get through to people to help them learn. So when you said that you went to art school, I was like, this makes complete sense.
Well, I love that you say that because I think, especially in special education, the relationships, and the same with general ed. I started out with in elementary ed, but found my way to special ed. And it feels to me like in special ed, your rapport with students, your relationships are everything. And there is such an art to that. It's an actual art that's hard to teach people how to build rapport, how to be someone that the kids not only like or not only don't mind spending time with, but actually like. And I remember being in high school and hearing this one teacher in school say, well, the kids don't have to like me. They just have to respect me. And I feel like that might work in general ed or in high school when it's, maybe more about content, but feels to me in elementary school and for special education for all grades, the kids really do have to like the teacher because a lot of what you're doing is going to be based on trust and relationship.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because
Because
vulnerable. You have to be vulnerable to learn,
Yes. It's funny. I just thought as you were saying that, like back in the 80s when I went to, I'm your contemporary, but I went to elementary school, so a while ago. And
Mhm.
then in the 90s when I went to high school, I can still remember the most meaningful teachers in my life. I remember my last elementary school teacher, Miss Bartell, who was just an amazingly good teacher. And it's very funny. So years later, 20 plus years later, I was going down to Atlanta for an event where I was the main person and she showed up. It was so cool. I hadn't been there that long, but I remember her. I remember the middle school teacher who had the best relationship with me, and I learned so much from her. I for my mom, I bought some of her husband's artwork, and it still hangs. I actually still hangs where my dad lives. And then in high school, I remember the three teachers, or two mainstream, one special ed. And I can see their faces and I can hear their voices in a way that I can't hear other people. But I also remember the one teacher who did not develop rapport, where we didn't develop rapport. And that was so difficult. Like, I'm not much of a crier, but I think that was like one of the things. Well, I guess in my older age, I've become more of one that it still struck me as like those people were so important to my life, my growth, my ability to believe in myself. And when you said trust, I thought of those group of amazing teachers and the one that I had difficulty with. And trust was so important. Like I never even thought of that until you mentioned it.
It's so true. I have to turn your listeners on to a fellow named Dr. Robert Brooks. He's a Harvard psychologist and professor and author, and he has a website. I think it's drrobertbrooks.org. I'll make sure to send it to you. He is a mentor and a friend, and my colleague Karen Steves and I have both been working with him for a while, and we had him come to do an in-service. He's done a few for our staff here at school. And one of the first things he said was to the staff, think of a teacher that really made a difference in your life. Think of a positive event that happened at school. Think of someone who made a difference. And everyone's, as you can see people thinking of something and everyone's smiling. And it was just such a positive experience. It was like,
Mm.
that's the impact you don't even know you're having on kids. And I feel the same way. And I too remember teachers that, either said something that as a super sensitive kid, I took the wrong way and probably they had no idea that they hurt my feelings, or just someone that I once got yelled at for having papers under my chair. Someone had ripped up a bunch of paper. It was seventh grade history class. And my teacher, Mr. Hamilton, he was this tall, like 6'5", booming man with like a huge pompadour of hair. What is that mess under your chair? And I was like, I don't know. I just got here. I have no idea. And he's like, what do you mean you have no idea who ripped up the papers? And I'm like, I don't know. And he's like, well, if you don't know, then it must have been you. And so I was tearing up because I wasn't a kid that got in trouble very frequently. And I went home, of course, crying, and my mom called him up. And I guess she had taken me, I don't remember this, blocked it out, but she says that she took me to school, like took me back up and made him apologize to me. And he said he learned that it was a different Laura. It was a Laura from a different
Oh
class
my.
in there the period before. But like, I blocked that memory out, but I do remember him yelling at me. And it's just,
Wow.
yeah, for
All these years. Wow.
you have to know that teachers can have, or any adults, can really have a lasting impact on kids. So you just hope that your impact is a good one because they stick.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. It's interesting that you say that because I think that's one of the amazing things about teaching, the ability to have impact. And So at my mom's funeral, there were several of, she hadn't been teaching for like, let's see, eh, 20 years maybe. At her funeral were a bunch of her students and their parents. And that like really, 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 really struck me, the impact. And it makes me, and it made me want to go reach out to a couple of those teachers. Like I looked up one and, shot a note off to another. But then the other side of it for me is that's an enormous amount of pressure, right? Not just the pressure for the learning, but realizing now as an adult, teachers are human beings just like everyone else. I did not get that news flash early, but human beings with bad days and good days and stomach aches and probably sometimes kids at home who are having their having their own challenges. And I was just thinking like you can do such good in a moment or such harm in a moment, and that's got to be a lot of pressure for a lot of teachers. Did you ever feel that pressure?
I don't know if I ever recognized it as pressure, but I definitely had times where if I snapped at one of the kids, I definitely recognized it in the moment and found it it didn't happen very often, but it has happened a few times in my career. I can't deny it. And I found it pretty easy right away after I snapped a little to immediately repair and be like, I'm sorry, I just have such a headache and I'm being cranky right now, and to normalize it. And I've always found that that goes so far, especially if you already have a good relationship with a student. I can't think of any good examples. And
Well, I can give you like a great example for me that like I had a teacher for several years because she, taught different versions of classes. And during the time she had like a pregnancy and also, like all sorts of normal stuff. And a couple times she snapped, but she would always explain it and put it in context. And I actually took something hugely important from her beyond the fact that like her mentorship and support spurred my whole career. Because as somebody with a reading, writing comprehension problem, it's by the grace of God, a great mother, and a great teacher that I ended up, becoming a writer for my career. But her willingness to show her vulnerability and make herself human made me feel okay for being vulnerable and for, see, I'm tearing up already, for being vulnerable and for not being perfect and not always like being the best person. And that vulnerability showed me that like even these people that I admire are just like me. So it doesn't mean that I can't be as meaningful as they are, if it makes sense.
yeah, that's such a meaningful lesson to learn from someone who probably had no idea they were teaching you that lesson just
Yep.
by being themselves, by being genuine, and by saying, actually, let me take you through this experience with me. Let me
Yeah.
take you.
Yes. Because teachers don't just, they're so influential in our lives and we spend so much time with them. They don't just teach us the subject, they teach us how to be good humans in the best situations, if that makes sense. I, one of the things that, in thinking about special education, and I had, you know, my mom had worked as a special education administrator until my brother and I were born. And then she went back into the classroom and became an administrator again. And I remember hearing her old stories about she worked in Maryland in state run special education schools. So, people who couldn't at the time be mainstreamed based on sort of like the approaches that we had at the time. And I've always been curious about how things have evolved over the years, from the 70s, 80s, 90s. How has teaching in special education changed and approaches have changed?
What a wonderful question that is. I even think of how it special ed and what I'm involved with right now feels so different than what I experienced in elementary, middle, high school. And I think, like, where were all the other kids that weren't, if we had a resource room in my elementary school and I knew of maybe 6 or 8 students that would access the resource room, there's probably more, but that's my little window into it. Where were the rest of the kids? Um, and so now I think I have a little more understanding, but I don't think at the time when I was in 6th grade, there couldn't have been as many what we call now outplacement schools or out of district schools. But
Mm.
at least here in Massachusetts, I don't know the number, but it's like 200 or 300 um, out of district school placements. Some are residential schools, some are day schools.
And those are the schools where people with special education needs aren't mixed in the classroom with, is that what the
Right,
outplacement schools
right.
are? Okay.
So these are schools, and the school I work at right now is one of these schools where it's just special education. It's not also there's no general ed involved, and so there's different levels of special education in the classroom. In the you know, typical school setting, you might have some students that are in the general ed classes, maybe supported by an aide. They might go to a resource room during the day. They might have some classes that are separate from the typical classroom. Like they might have a special ed teacher who teaches them. Often math and English are the most frequent, I think, to have these kind of smaller special ed classes. And if that level of support isn't working, you might have, it seems more common for students to have aides in the younger years, or maybe students will still have aides during their older years, like in high school, but one aide will have like 5 kids that they're kind of supporting.
And we had these basic skills courses that were really cool where you would be mainstream, but you'd have one class where they called it basic skills, but really what it was like a combination of like social skills, life skills, learning skills. And I love those. Even so, it was very funny because one of my goals was like, okay, by high school, I'm going to get out of all my special education classes. But then I had this one teacher, I think when I first went to high school, and I was like, oh, this is too good.
Well, it's so funny because it's like there's also this world of special education outside of the general ed or the public school setting where it's considered a lot more kind of removed and a lot more restrictive. But for some students, it's a lot more comfortable and a lot more freeing. And so when you're actually outplaced from your district, when you have to, unfortunately, it's like a fail first model where you have to prove that you need intensive services. You have to keep.
And that's the cost that drives that, not so much that,
Yeah,
yeah.
I believe so because it is really, really expensive to be placed out of district. And that's just considering the tuition for the school because it's smaller class sizes. There's OTs, there's speech therapists, there's social workers. Not that a typical public school doesn't have these, but the ratio, the number of students is a lot smaller that each kind of professional is working with. And you aren't even talking about the cost of transporting students to these special level schools.
Mhm. All things that legally sort of like the government says students need, right? Like the transportation,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
meals, yeah.
It all has to be done. But I think what's nice about all the different schools, at least across Massachusetts, for example, there's 250 schools or however many. Each school can kind of specialize in a different population. And so it does seem more restrictive to have to go to a small specialized school where there are no general education teachers, we're all
Mm.
special ed teachers. And not all private special ed schools are that way. There are some gen ed teachers and some, but it's this kind of considered really restrictive setting. But at the same time, for students who need that setting, it feels very normal. And having a small school setting or small class size feels much more normal and freeing. And so it feels less.
Yeah. You use that word freeing.
Yeah.
Like, I think one of the things that I think we can forget in life is that sometimes structure, because I'm a person who abhors structure, but it's very interesting in this other way. I do like it because it gives me guardrails. And once I have those guardrails, then I like to say, once I have the guardrails, I can dance without worrying about falling off the mountain. And there's something so cool about that and the creativity that can actually happen in that space that I think the general public considers pretty restrictive. But, if you take that same creativity and you apply it in a space that has no guardrails, that's where somebody, I think, can sometimes get hurt, or they can make social missteps, or they can, lose the opportunity to learn. But I think for some people, and some of this isn't just about being special, sometimes it's just personality. And I would say in my case, it's definitely personality. But I hire people around me who are really good at building guardrails. but um but yeah, there's something cool about how like building that can free it. Like I even think of my friends who are artists who have a little bit of anxiety, let's say. Like when they have that safe space and they know the space, they become so creative. And I bet it's true for the teachers as well as the students that it enhances that opportunity to be more flexible, to develop relationships, to do cool things that really work for the individuals who are there instead of sort of, one of the things that my math teacher in was a general ed math teacher. And it was very funny because I was like, absolutely in retrospect, so bored in the class. And he said, like, if you look at a math problem, generally, I've got 23 to 27 students and I have to teach the lowest common denominator. And I feel like in smaller classes, there's a way to kind of more easily teach to your different audiences and really personalize education in a whole different way.
Yeah, it's so true. I think my, I, I don't know if I have a lot of opinions about education because it's so different for everyone, but I feel like smaller class size is one thing that I feel really strongly about. That as class sizes get larger and larger, it's just clear that that's a lot for one teacher to handle. And the smaller the class size, the better you can support the students because they're all, even if you have everyone working at a certain grade level, even within a grade level, there are so many little, marks of someone might be working 3 months ahead of another student. Someone else might be 3 months behind. So for 30 kids in a classroom, you've got 30 different spots of where abilities are, and you're trying to keep
Mm.
everyone interested and not too bored and differentiate and, but not have anyone feel different. And it's just a really challenging thing for a teacher.
Well,
Oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was just going to say one of the things that you made me think of is like in the shoes of the students, and you had made that point about trust and relationships, that the further you are removed from your teacher, I'm thinking right now about college and my 300-person lecture classes as opposed to the seminars, the further you're removed from that relationship, I think the harder it can be to focus and to learn. And it might be great for like a freshman, I don't know, geology class, but I think that relationship, as I'm thinking about what you're saying, is that relationship between teacher and student, just like employee and boss, or person and mentor, or mom and kid. That relationship drives, because in some ways, like I think about how scary the world is for an elementary school kid. Like everything is new. It can be scary or it can be exciting, but the partner you have holding your hand through it is so important. And the further you are from that partner, the more you're alone and the scarier it gets, as opposed to exciting, if that makes sense. So,
That's such a beautiful way to put that. It's so true. That was so
yeah.
well said.
I By the way, I didn't even ask you, where did you grow up? And, did you go to public schools or private schools as a kid? Did you have positive learning experiences?
I grew up in a town called Burnt Hills, New York. It's near Schenectady, which is near Albany. I just went to regular public school. I think we only had a few kids around us that went to like a Christian school nearby. But other than that, everyone went to public school. I always had a really wonderful experience in school. I was like that typical, I feel like sometimes female students just have good experiences and they're a little bit like, I was good at reading and writing. And until middle school, I was good at math. And so things, went well for me. The math didn't come so easy from seventh grade on, but it was just a nice experience in a relatively small town where you knew your teachers cared about you, and I knew my parents supported me. So I have no complaints other than when I look back, I wish that I had been taught math a little bit differently because the way it was being taught to me, it didn't make sense.
Hmm.
I think, to be honest, that's what a lot of students go through. And it's kind of like, well, I can try to explain it another way, but here's the info. You have to get it. And if that's not how your mind works, I didn't notice a lot of work to help me get it. It's like it was all on me.
Yeah, I have a friend who's a math teacher, and one of the things, and he's a career transition teacher. He had been a businessman for a while and an entrepreneur, and then decided to, after he retired early, decided to go into teaching. And one of the things he said to me that really struck me was that I'm not sure why we aren't focused at primarily on the outcome at the end of the year, not like what students learn this quarter or that quarter, because people learn in different ways and different speeds. And his other thing was, why aren't we teaching math creatively? Like we teach order of operations and we teach, all these very formulas. And he gave this example, and I was like, this was me in the same algebra class that I was talking about before. Our our teacher would give us problems, and the job was to solve the homework and lay out your homework. Well, I would look at the problems, solve them in my head, and then just give the answer. And like that was not good enough. And what I realized afterwards is the way that I actually like my brain, my personality works is I make this leap toward the answer, and then I go back, and this plays out with like every business idea I have, every creative idea. Like I jump to what I think the answer is, and then I go back and try and disprove myself. So like if I had learned math as the first step is, here's the problem, and Jason, you're allowed to solve it in your brain, and then you're allowed to go back and show and verify that was right. It would have been a great way and a fun way for me to learn math. And I just say this by saying that, like, sometimes broadening our aperture to the ways that, because also when I was in college, I taught as a TA journalism and grammar, and the English language is a mess and has no logic to it, and all that other stuff. So, all the challenges there. But one of the things I just noticed is like in the writing profession, people get to good writing in completely different ways, and more of that creativity, I guess.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, I have to tell you that math is actually, I don't know if I even want to say one of, probably my most favorite thing to teach
Oh
because
wow!
I love I always know where kids are going to go wrong because I went wrong. And I love to see the difference of, it feels to me like sometimes the most creative thinkers are the ones that a little bit go off the rails on the way to solving a problem. And I think if you were to take a couple steps back and look at it, if you could take your student a few steps back and look and see like, oh yeah, that doesn't make sense. Why did I do that? with these little mistakes, but that's also the creative process where you're thinking, oh, it can't be that easy, or it
Yeah. Yeah.
has to be this, and you kind of like outsmart yourself to the point where you get stuff wrong or you
Hmm.
overthink it. um and it's just so funny because I can always see the, or at least, when I was teaching, I'm an administrator now, but I could just see the exact mistakes my kids were going to make, and it's like, because I made these same mistakes. And it's a little part and parcel of how we think when you don't naturally think in a linear kind of
Way.
way. And I have so much appreciation for people whose minds think that way. It's fascinating to me. And I would love to have like a little taste of that. It's just it works.
Well, the funny thing, so I'm a total overthinker. I am notorious, and I bet if my math teacher's still alive, they still remember this. But I'm notorious for saying they would lay out a problem, and I would say, well, it depends on what you mean by X, right? Because like the ambiguity in their language, I would instantly pick up on. No one else in the room saw it as ambiguous because in their brains, they're like 90% sure that it was what, but like I was notorious. Could you please clarify, because that could mean this or it could mean this. And then the other thing that I was sort of thinking about as you were laying that out beyond sort of like the overthinking piece of it was that like we as humans are so helpful to each other because of, not in spite of, but because of our mistakes. Like the things that we struggle with as people are often the things that we're best at helping other people at. And that just seems like a good example. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that is so true. And we tend to have more compassion because we've been there. We don't have to try to imagine what it's like to be in shoes where someone's struggling if we have lived that struggle and felt bad about it. I spent a lot of, both my parents know me as someone who was constantly crying at the kitchen table every night trying to do my math homework in high school. And, I just never believed that it would get any better. I actually had a wonderful high school math teacher. I babysat for her. She would like have me over to the house and try to spend all this extra time with me, but like nothing was getting through.
I remember those days, like with growing up in high school with my mom's students around our kitchen table, and I was like, "This is not normal, but it's so awesome."
Right. There's no extra pay for that. And yet, there's
But
no.
I will say, as like a young kid, it was really cool because she was teaching kids that were older than me, so I could learn stuff from them, and I would always pick their brains and other things like that. So they're learning from my mom as they're struggling, and they're totally teaching me and not knowing it. So
I could see that would be so cool. So cool. Well, it's just funny because now, even as an administrator, when we bring new teachers on, and at my school, we just have special ed teachers, and it's really hard to get someone willing to teach math. And so many of the teachers are like, oh, I'm really not comfortable. And I completely understand. I lived that, like I think we probably had similar experiences in school. But even through the process of being stuck teaching it without a choice and knowing that you're working with kids that are struggling too, it's like a healing experience to say, oh, I
yes,
can do this with my now adult brain. I can figure
yes,
it out,
right, because you're constantly right, like proving that you can. That's actually a really great point. Like one of the things I was just thinking about as you're talking is that teachers are, so much more than just sort of like educators, right? They serve roles as social workers, right? They're the first line of defense often when something is going wrong at home, like it's gonna come up at school. They sometimes even mentor parents, or sometimes they have to be like the police in the in the building and outside of the building. And I'm just curious about like, I think of one example from my mom's teaching. There was a kid in our neighborhood who went to the school, and one day they were talking at school about what could have been potentially, and in retrospect, I think was abuse at home. and their teachers were the first ones who found out about it. I can think of another example of a student that she had where there was no food at home, right? Like the parents were struggling so much that there was, and it was responsible, caring, loving parents, but they were just struggling. And my mom got them in touch with something called Western Fairfax Christian Ministries in Virginia and got them food. And I just think teachers play, the first line of defense for so many things in addition to being educators. And I was wondering whether you sort of feel that way, or that becomes a part of the informal role of teaching. Like I think of like what Hillary Clinton said about how it takes a village. Well, like who are the key people in our village?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like people that work in schools, teachers and aides and teaching assistants, and other service providers, speech therapists, OTs, are definitely on the front lines. I feel like I've lived a relatively sheltered life, and I haven't run into too much, but I do. I briefly taught in a town that was just a kind of a lower level of socioeconomic um, status.
Status. Yeah.
And it was really challenging because the kids would come in and you were pretty sure that they probably didn't eat breakfast. They all had the school breakfast. And I was surprised at how much time it would take out of their morning. Like I don't think it was supposed to take the whole first class, but it pretty much did. And the kids would fight over, like if there was a leftover apple or an orange, or if someone didn't want their apple. I don't know why they're having apples for breakfast, but that in my memory, that's what was there. That, two kids would be like, well, I'll have it. And then it would be really hard for the one friend to decide who to give the apple to. So for the brief time I was in this district, I was always trying to have all this extra food in my classroom because
Mm.
kids were always hungry. And to be honest, I had never run into that before. I had really only worked in suburban districts, and I had worked in some inner city schools in Schenectady, New York, but I didn't run into the same thing. Of course, I wasn't the teacher. I like student taught, and I did I don't know if you've heard of AmeriCorps. It's kind of
Yeah, AmeriCorps, the volunteer program that the federal government has that lets you can go off and do things like teaching and then receive reimbursement for some of your,
yeah.
did I get that right? Yeah.
It was a really cool experience. And I did that in Schenectady, New York, but it was really working one on one or one to one on literacy skills with kids. So I wasn't the teacher responsible for making sure everyone got breakfast. So I'm sure they have that there. But for the brief time I taught in this one district here in Mass, and I ran into this, I just couldn't believe how much attention was placed on food during whether it was lunch or breakfast. And it was just breaking my heart every day. And I was spending a lot of money just trying to keep saltines and apples and, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. I can remember those trips as a kid. You just made me think of this, and I probably haven't thought about it in years. But when we were living in Georgia, we were in Marietta, Georgia, and I think it was in Atlanta or somewhere else. There was this multi-story school supply store. And we would go every year with our mom to get the supplies for her classroom. But half of what she would buy would be like notebooks and other things like that just for the kids where their families couldn't afford them. And there are all these things that teachers do. Your Apple story had me thinking about like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that idea of like first our physiological needs come first, then our needs for safety and security, then love and belonging, and then self-esteem, and then finally that idea of self-actualization. But like if your physiological needs aren't being met, like if you don't have food, if you don't have water, if you don't have shelter, if you're not getting sleep, it's really hard to get to the point where you can have sort of health or even social ability or friendships or love or learning or belonging. And yeah, it just made me think of that.
Yeah, it's so tough. It's really tough to be a child, and especially if you're coming in and you might not have, warm enough clothes, let alone cool clothes, or something to eat, let alone something good to eat. And I think it's a little bit easier, at least from what I saw, when everyone was in the same boat and you could just try to do the best you can, like as a teacher, and have food for everyone in the classroom. And it's not like there were
Yeah.
two kids that everyone had plenty of food and two kids didn't. So that was a weird kind of blessing, but it's just so tough.
As a creative person and as a person who has some element of anxiety, the space where you're going to probably excel and feel most comfortable is where you are given that freedom, right? To accomplish. So what do you, from your perspective, like, in your shoes or more broadly the school or maybe both, what are you guys trying to accomplish at Pathways?
Ooh, I love this question. Right now, we're still trying to recover the kids from the pandemic. Everyone is
Mm,
stuck, it not stuck, but the ripple effects are so much farther reaching and than we ever thought. And I think a lot of it is probably best described in where our 11th and 12th or 12 plus grade students were pre-pandemic. And it's a very distinct line in my mind because we were in an actual different building. We moved at the height of the pandemic. So when I think of us in the old building, and of course there's rose colored glasses, but students in those latter years of high school or later years versus students that are at 11th, 12th, and 12 plus right now, because we do have students up until age 22, they're so different. It's like they lost a couple of years, and it's
mm,
academic, it's emotional, it's social. So it feels like we're just trying to keep
catch up.
everything growing and moving forward and catching up. But from a broader perspective, it's also an interesting question because we have a population of students with, most of our students have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Most of our students have a profile that is like an Asperger's profile. Most of our students have a lot of anxiety, and that combination makes it so challenging. It's not, I think, to the average person on the street. If you have someone who struggles with social skills, well, you teach them the social skill and they learn it and then they're good, right? It
Mhm.
doesn't work that way. We have some students who really feel, and this happened before the pandemic, of course, as well. This has just always been there, this kind of, why are you trying to change me? Am I not good enough as I am, just because
Yep.
start a conversation a certain way? So, or what have you. So,
There's a lot, I think, for people, I still call it Asperger's, but, who are on the autism spectrum or even people with ADHD or, other things that cause them to struggle with like time management or social skills or where I think in our attempts to help them, which I think are very well meaning, sometimes we're accidentally sending the message that, and it's illustrated in this book, Andrew Solomon, writer, wrote about, it's called Far from the Tree. And it deals with like a lot of situations where, like where the child, thinking of it like the apple falls far from the tree, like maybe a deaf child to hearing parents, a kid with Asperger's whose parents are, are don't have it, or the gay child of straight parents. He even does in the book, one of the school shooters from Columbine and his parents. But in the chapter, and I think it's a chapter on the person on the autism spectrum, the mother is searching for the cure, right? She's fighting for the cure. And the way the son describes how it feels is that it feels like my mom loves me so much, just if I were a little different. And I think getting behind that, past that hurdle, and being able to show people that there are some beautiful things about the things that make them different, but what we're trying to help them with will just help them adjust better and be more adaptable in the world is a delicate, again, going back to your point about trust, it's just a delicate, it's an art.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And there is so much wrapped up in it because when you've been doing something a certain way for so long and that way happens to make sense for you, I can relate to this. There's certain things I do that if someone all of a sudden came along and they were like, so could you tweak it? Could you do this? Could you just do this a little different? Because it's off putting when you do that. It just, everything feels like, feedback or supportive, constructive criticism can feel like such an affront. So, we really do try to balance in a real mindful way the embracing of neurodiversity, helping kids understand that everyone's brain is wired differently, and there's some styles of wiring that are, kind of a certain way, and other people might be wired a little bit differently, what have you. And there's some people who, just they expect only one style of wiring and they're just not used to, someone who only likes to talk about trains or who only likes to talk about Pokemon and that, they want to have some conversation about stuff that they like to talk about. I feel like Pokemon's a super dated reference. I don't know where that came from. Uh,
I don't think so.
like I'm wearing a Pokemon shirt as we speak.
Well, to your point about neurodiversity, and I think sometimes, people will look at that as a buzzword that having something like autism and Asperger's we classify from a medical perspective as a disease, but I think or a disorder, but I think it's really more than that because to your point, it's really a different way of thinking that presents challenges that we treat, but they're parts of it that should be embraced because, while it's not confirmed, we probably wouldn't have had, without autism spectrum, we wouldn't have had Albert Einstein or even the actor Dan Aykroyd or Anthony Hopkins or Tim Burton or even Darwin, right? So if you're thinking, and I think Emily Dickinson, some people speculate, Bobby Fischer, who's the master chess player, some people speculate about Bill Gates and Michelangelo. So, like, can you imagine a world in which we did not have those people? Like, I wouldn't want to be in that world.
Oh, it's so true. It's so true. And it's just so easy to want, and very human nature of us to want concrete groups and to say this is normal, this is not normal. But nothing works that way. It's just our own way of trying to make the world smaller so we can get our minds around it.
Well, it goes back to that idea of conforming that you were talking about. I'm beginning to see why you might be a really good fit for this. Right. Your appreciation for, like, I think progress and diversity in a way, right? Diversity of thinking or diversity of approaches. I'm black, my mom's black. And I think diversity probably helped her think about different ways to different people. But one thing that really helped her growing up in a one-room schoolroom with kids in multiple grades and having to teach topics like she was taught by the same teacher in the same one room with fifth graders, fourth graders, third graders. And I think appreciating, there are very obvious ways, like age is an easy way to understand diversity. But I think with so many other ways, we don't appreciate like the really awesome benefits of it sometimes.
Yeah. That's so true. That's so neat. It almost feels like I know it's kind of where we came from, and you think of the one room schoolhouse as being kind of an historic thing that we've grown from, but it almost feels like, in a way, somewhere we could head in the future where
We need a little of that back.
Yeah, where we purposely do that in order to, I don't know, create a learning community that is a little less, I don't know, a little less static and a little less linear and a little more community and I don't know, people based.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think to your point about people focus, right, as opposed to score focus. That sense of community is probably what's lacking in this our current world the most today. We're all interconnected, but I don't know that we have those same. I mean, not everywhere, but there are places where we have it, but that same sense of community. I'm curious from your perspective, just thinking about children in general or people learning in general, and then also special education students. What would like a just and fair world for students really like truly look like for you? Like, what would we be doing for students in that world?
Wow, what a question. Hmm. What comes to mind right away is I would like us to be able to take the time and the resources to teach each student as they need to be taught or as they are best taught. And for so many students, that is not sitting still at a desk. It's just not. And for other students, it is. I think I probably, was a great sit at a desk type of student. My brother, the opposite, not someone who likes sitting still. I think also the ability to really recognize that tests are not the best way to measure knowledge. Again, for some people, they might be. And I think educational leaders give the idea of, testing isn't the only way to measure knowledge. It gets a lot of lip service. But in reality, it always comes back to that. And so even for teacher tests, you have
Mm.
who really want to be teachers, and we really need teachers. And they don't test well. They might have a lot of physical symptoms at the very thought of taking a test.
Yeah, test anxiety. Yeah.
Extreme test anxiety, but that is really the only way to become a teacher. And really, there's starting to be a little experimentation with some other avenues, but it just seems like in a field where we value, or we at least say we value, different types of intelligence and different types of learning, and yet everything can hang on a test with, I don't know if it's changed, but at one point, the foundations of reading test in Massachusetts that all special ed teachers need to take had a 40% pass rate. So even for your average test taker, it was extremely narrow and challenging and not necessarily something every special ed teacher needs to know. But that was what was decided would be the benchmark test. And in a field where we need people that care about kids to, um, have people hung up on taking a test. I've known people who have had to take it 5, 6, 7, 8 times, each time, paying you $100. And
Oh wow.
it's a hit on morale. And yet eventually, if you can pass and you could be a special ed teacher, hopefully it's gotten better by now, but I actually don't think it has. I think just knowing that there really are other ways to learn, to support learning, to show what you've learned. And so it's not just for the kids, but for teachers as well. Just embracing it.
Well, let me just thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was a fascinating conversation, per usual, and not exactly what I expected, never what I expected, which is like the best part of it. I am, no, I mean, I think one of the things that I think is really important is for those of us who aren't doing the work that you guys are doing. We talk about it with salaries and other things like that, but I'm not sure that's the important part. To have such an appreciation and understanding of the impact that teachers can have on our lives. Like, It's a underutilized resource and an underappreciated resource, both for, I think, so many students don't know, and so many parents don't know. And I think to some extent, some teachers don't even know what impact. So I'm, yeah, I'm grateful for the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
For those of you who are Patreon members, hop over to the Patreon page for a bonus episode with Laura where we discuss one of her favorite student stories, some of the interesting psychiatric patients that have been at McLean, my bipolar disorder, and the moment where Laura got so burnt out by teaching that she wanted to work in an inpatient psychiatric ward. If you'd like to join me for more discussions with other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with me and other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. We'll see you all again next week.